So again, thank you everyone for joining us for our secondary application 2024 cycle application workshop. My name is Anna Petrak. I'm the Assistant Director of Pre-Med Pre-Health Programs here at Northeastern, and I'm joined by my colleagues who are helping me out behind the scenes. You'll see them later at the end of the presentation during Q&As. And we'll kind of just get going. So on our next slide, we're going to see our agenda items for today, just to give you an idea of what to expect. We're kind of going to go over the purpose of secondary applications, what you can expect to see in secondary applications. We're going to talk a little bit about pre-writing your secondaries and using that to your advantage. We're going to talk about like when you receive them, how you receive them, and the timeline recommended to submit. So we'll jump right into it and talk about the purpose of secondary applications. So secondary applications are really an opportunity for schools to learn about who you are outside of what you already discussed in your primary application. So they just want to learn more about you. It's an opportunity for the schools to ask specific questions about their program. So things like, why are you interested in attending their school and what can you add to their entering class? It's also a continued assessment of the core competencies that you have. It's also going to help them narrow down applicants that they're going to eventually invite for interviews. And ultimately, it's an opportunity to prove your fit at that institution. So it's going to help determine what you have in common with those programs based on your experiences that you've had so far as they relate to the mission and core values of the programs you're applying to. So now we'll talk about a little bit like what's included in secondaries, and it covers a couple of things. So things for you to know, most programs will send you secondaries directly. Typically, very little vetting is done between primary and secondary applications. So you can expect to hear from the majority of schools that you apply to. That's why it's super important that you monitor your email that's associated with AMCAS or COMAS, whatever application service that you're using, because that's likely where you're going to hear from schools. After that, they might have school-specific portals, but they're going to communicate that with you via email. So keep an eye on that email. Something to keep in mind is that while that's how MD schools will probably primarily reach out to you, some DO programs embed their secondary questions within their primary application. So it's important to kind of take note of that. And so if any of the schools that you apply to that are DO have that sort of system where secondary questions are embedded within the primary app, you're going to find that under the programs material section of your ACOMAS application. So be sure to check that out. And so what can you expect for secondary questions? Typically, they're going to be like several short essay type questions from the schools that you apply to. The number of questions, the character length allotted for your responses, that stuff can vary program to program. So it's not like a cookie cutter response that you can have for every single school. One thing to know is that you're going to probably encounter some very similar themes across programs, even though questions might look a little bit different. There are some themes that might remain consistent across schools that you apply to, and then you always sort of like individualize your responses to schools. So certain concepts that you write might sort of remain the same, but again, you individualize for each. And then some secondaries might ask questions or ask for information that was already in your primary application. You might wonder, why are they asking for this? I already told them. That's really just to ensure that you've met specific criteria that they're looking for. So the second part we want to talk about for what's included in secondaries on this slide is secondary fees. So secondary fees can really add up, especially if you're applying to a number of programs. So we recommend really being mindful of your budget when it comes to your school list that you're applying to make sure you're a good fit. So this is sort of a plug for a previous application workshop that we had earlier in the spring semester for building your school list. The recording is available on our website. Just something to note that increasing the number of schools that you apply to doesn't necessarily increase your chances of acceptance. So a well-crafted and strategic school list will get you farther. So definitely go back and watch that school list workshop if you have time. But to review some average costs, secondary applications can vary quite a bit, anywhere from $30 to $250 per school. On average, it's usually around $100 per school. And there is some fee assistance available to help offset the cost of secondaries. And we're going to link these here on this slide that will be available to you so you can learn more about how to apply for that if you qualify. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the committee letter as it relates to secondary timelines. You'll notice some asterisks there. That's because we want to provide some context. So So our office works on committee letter writing all throughout the summer. We receive a high volume of requests, so it takes us quite a bit of time to work through writing and submitting those to Central Application Services. I say that to explain that the committee letters are not required to be submitted for your primary application to be verified, and you're probably going to get secondaries even before your committee letter is submitted, and I promise you that that's fine. It's kind of standard practice in pre-med pre-health advising across the country for schools that offer committee letters. Very common for other advisors to also be writing all summer. And we partner with medical schools, so they're very aware of the timeline and how long it takes to write and submit those. So they're not expecting those to be submitted alongside your secondaries. They're understanding that those will typically come in by the end of the summer. So I just want to put you all at ease with that, because I know we frequently get questions of like, is the committee letter submission timeline going to negatively impact your application? And the answer is no, it will not. You might notice that some secondary applications might not be marked as complete until the committee letter is submitted, and that's okay. In fact, we've even seen students who have been invited for interviews before their committee letter is received. So just some food for thought there in terms of how the committee letter is related to secondary timelines. So we're going to move on to the CASPER exam or test. Some of you might be familiar with that already, and some of you might not. CASPER is a situational judgment test. It's been around for a couple of years, but it's still quite new, and schools are really, medical schools or health profession schools are still really learning how scores are going to be helpful to them in the admissions process. The hope is that it's going to provide a holistic view of an applicant in ways that the primary application cannot. So things that you should know are like, is this something I need to study for? The CASPER website has some really helpful information for you to sort of understand what to expect on the exam, but we want to assure you it's nothing that you need to like study or cram for. We do suggest going on CASPER's website to read about the exam, understand what you'll be tested on. It's really going to be hypothetical scenarios or like ethical dilemma type questions, and they just want to see how you would respond. There's typically not a right or a wrong answer for the most part. It's really they want to see how you critically think to get to your conclusion, or the steps you would take to reach that answer that you provide. So again, nothing you can like study for. They do have practice questions available on their website, so we would suggest using those, but please do not go out and buy test prep materials. It's a waste of your money. Our office has even sat in like presentations by the folks who make CASPER, and they have indicated that there is no difference in terms of what they see with scores for those who have done formalized test prep courses compared to those who've only done like the few practice questions that are available. So please don't overstress on CASPER. Essentially, it's going to assess your interpersonal traits and how you would respond to ethical dilemmas. You will register for the test directly on the CASPER website, which we have here linked on the slide. And when should you take it? So the sweet spot for taking the exam is usually after you submit your primary application and before you get your secondary. So anytime before you get those. And just so that you know, the CASPER exam is good for 1 year. So now that you've taken the exam, or once you take the exam, you're probably wondering, now what? Just so that you know, scores will automatically be submitted to the schools that you selected at the time you register for CASPER. So when you register to take the exam, they're going to ask you medical schools to include that you want the score sent to. And so that's where you're going to check those boxes. If for whatever reason you add schools on after you take the CASPER exam, you can go on their website and do that. Moving on to yet another test, the double AMC preview. Very similar to the CASPER in that it's like a situational judgment test. You'll be presented like hypothetical scenarios to which you'll have to respond. The double AMC preview is a little bit less commonly required than CASPER. So once you have your school list, definitely do some digging to see if they even require it. That information will be available on like MSAR or the school's website directly. So to make sure, like, are you applying to schools that even require it? Because if they don't, then you might not need to take it at all. All right, moving on to pre-writing your secondaries. So I think before we kind of like talk about what that would look like, I think it's helpful to have some context of like the timeline. So both AMCAS and ACOMAS are currently open for submission. Some of you may have already submitted your primary applications, which is great. That's kind of a feat in itself. Once you do submit, your application goes through a verification process that can take up to several weeks. That really depends on the volume and how quickly the Central Application Services can get through their internal processes. So once you are verified, applications are then sent in batches to medical programs. For AMCAS, that first batch isn't until the end of June. So if you've already submitted your AMCAS application and it's verified, your application is just sort of like sitting there at this point, and no schools have seen it yet. So just so you have an idea. And if you haven't submitted your application yet, that's just kind of proves like you're not late in the process. You still have time to do that. So keep all that in mind. Now for COMIS, they're doing things a little bit different this year. Applications have been open for submission since May 4th, and they've just been sort of reviewing and verifying more so on a rolling basis. So they're sending your verified application to schools as soon as it's verified. There's not this like sort of like waiting period, similar to how AMCAS has the waiting period. And as a reminder, the committee letter is not required for your application to be verified, so you're good there. All that being said, in terms of like where we're at in the timeline for pre-writing secondaries, after you submit your application and you're waiting for your secondaries or waiting to be verified, that's kind of the perfect time to do some pre-drafting of secondary materials. So we're going to move on to the next slide where we're going to talk a little bit more about pre-writing secondaries. First and foremost, super important to stay organized. As I mentioned on a previous slide, you're probably going to get secondaries from most of the schools that you apply to. So if you're applying to, let's say, 20 schools, that's a lot of secondaries. They might each have 3 to 5 questions, for example. So it's really helpful to keep all of your application materials in one place to track which schools you've heard from, when you heard from them, what their submission deadlines are, and have you started writing your responses. So definitely track all that. There's a lot of moving parts in the process, so we encourage you to stay as organized as you can. You'll notice on this slide we have 2 websites linked here. What's nice about these, if you go on those websites, you're going to see essay prompts that have been used in previous cycles. So you can use those to your advantage and go on there and see what questions have been asked at schools you plan to apply to or that you have applied to get an idea of what to expect as you start to draft. So as I mentioned earlier, even though questions might change a little bit here and there, general themes and concepts will probably remain the same. So you can go back, look what they've done in the past, and sort of predict what they're going to ask in the future, because it might not change all that much. And then that's how you would start to draft your response. So keep that in mind. That's a good way to kind of like start drafting your essays for that. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to talk about how to sort of like fine tune your responses for common questions. So there's going to be kind of like the ones you'll expect to hear, right? So why are you interested in our school? How would you add diversity to our school? Describe an obstacle you've overcome. So let's say a bunch of the schools you're applying to ask those questions. Even though your responses will be quite similar, you should sort of like vary them a little bit and make them specific to that school. But you can definitely pre-draft those so you sort of have like a template almost ready to go, and then you fine tune it as you're getting ready to submit. One thing we definitely want to point out here is that a common question asked is going to be like, have you ever taken any time off from your undergraduate studies? Most, if not all of you, probably took part in co-op while you were at Northeastern. Co-op is part of your undergraduate education. It's not time off, so you would not need to address that in that section if you're asked. They're more so looking for things like, did you take a leave of absence? And you would explain why you might have done that. You'll probably also you're commonly asked, is there anything else you want us to know? This is usually like an optional question, but when you get that question, sort of consider what you haven't already included in your primary, and then consider the questions not asked in secondary. So for example, if a school doesn't specifically ask why our school or how would you add diversity to our entering class, consider drafting something to that effect. But if you really feel like you've covered all of your bases, it's okay to leave it blank. And then another common question that has been asked over the last couple of years is like COVID-19 related questions. So you don't need to sort of explain or justify circumstances that affected all applicants, such as, oh, my class has moved from in-persons to remote. That's going to be true of like all of your peers who apply, right? So they already know that. You don't need to tell them. But instead, I would encourage you to think a little bit deeper. How has COVID-19 impacted the way you view medicine? How has it continue to motivate you to pursue the profession? This is also a place, of course, that you could address any significant personal experiences related to the pandemic, such as like health and well-being of loved ones. But think more broadly of like unique reflections of the pandemic, more so than the standard, oh, my classes were moved to pass-fail or my MCAT was canceled, just to provide some context there. All right, and then next we're going to talk about using secondaries to your advantage. So This is sort of, secondaries are sort of your opportunity to shine in terms of fit at that school. So it's going to provide you an opportunity to highlight the school fit and integrate into information that are specific to you and your personal experiences, work experience, lived experience that make you a good fit at that school. It's kind of like, hey, look at all the stuff we have in common. So in terms of like developing your responses for that fit piece, you can sort of consider the following things in terms of like what you might want to look into, because it kind of takes a little bit of like research on your part to really learn about a school beyond what's on their homepage of their website, right? So if you've attended any of our like school visits, those are super helpful to go to or watch. If schools are having any like virtual open houses over the summer, those are great to go to. But you can look at the school's mission, their values, and try to like read between the lines a little bit. Usually their websites have like a letter from the dean of admissions at those schools to learn about the school in that context. You definitely want to look at like the curriculum information, any special programming or elective opportunities, their teaching hospital, are there research opportunities that you're interested in? You really want to pull out specifics because they want to know that you've invested time to see what they have to offer. And then again, you kind of pull it all together of like, these are all the things that I want to contribute and you offer them. And that's why I'd be a good fit at your school. Okay, moving on to receiving your secondaries. So you want to review your drafted responses very carefully, make sure that you're addressing the appropriate programs as you're kind of specifying for each individual school that you apply to. Carefully make appropriate edits so that your responses are unique to the program that you're applying to. Make sure to proofread. Can't stress that enough. Make sure that there's no grammatical errors, typos, things like that. And then sort of asking yourself, am I telling the reader something new? You really don't want your secondaries to be a place to reiterate items you've already covered in your primary application. Of course, again, themes, concepts will remain the same, but you don't want to necessarily sort of like sound like a broken record, right? You want to always kind of be telling the reader something new about you. And then finally, get another set of eyes on these responses. So having friends, family, a mentor, the Northeastern Writing Center, always great to have another set of eyes on your drafts before you submit. Always make sure to, when you are kind of going through these, making sure that when you have your draft that you're ready to go, like reread the question they're asking you. Am I answering the question that they're asking me? That's really important. And then finally, we're going to move on to like the timeline of submitting your secondaries. So schools have like set deadlines in terms of when secondaries are due. We recommend submitting your secondaries within 2 weeks of receiving them. So a 2-week turnaround time, regardless of the due date that the school says, because this is the part that a lot of people fall behind on, because it is hard to kind of keep up with these. So you want to do the best to stay organized that you can. And then once they're submitted to schools, they're kind of like reviewing them as a whole, and you want to kind of be at the front end of that. Really important as you are trying to stay on track for submitting them in a timely manner, prioritize. Submit your secondaries based on the priority you give each of the prospective schools that you're applying to. Also making sure that you're prioritizing some like the practical and target schools that are on your list. You don't want to only prioritize the Harvards and Stanfords of the world. You want to be really practical based on your depth of experiences, your metrics, your mission, your fit to that school. If you're a great fit by all of those standards, like those are the things, the schools you kind of want to prioritize, right? And then maintain quality. Again, review before submitting. And of course, submit promptly. Without completing a secondary, it's very unlikely that you would get an interview invitation. And then, of course, the fun part, payment. Don't forget to submit your secondary fee. Obviously, that's required for schools to read them. And so that sort of brings me to the end of the presentation. Pretty straightforward. If you all have any questions and want to type them in the chat, all of your advisors are here. I think Courtney wasn't able to join, but the rest of us are here. If you have questions, we can kind of get that portion of the presentation going.
Anna, do you want me to stop the recording or do you want to record the questions?
We can record them. Let's see in the chat here. I noticed some schools ask us to write about significant clinical experiences. If I discuss this in my primary, what approach do you suggest for answering this question without repeating too much information? I would suggest thinking about that experience in ways that maybe you didn't write about in your primary application. So do you have an anecdote or an example to provide like evidence of what you learned from those experiences, the biggest takeaways? The hope is that you have the depth and breadth of experiences that you will have a lot to share. So again, I don't want to repeat verbatim, especially what was in your primary application because they've already learned that. Next question, should you send your CASPER score to schools that don't require it? You could, but they don't require it, so they might not even look at it. I would just send it to the schools that require it. Can I get into medical school without research experience? It depends on the school. Some schools are very much interested in seeing research on your application, research institutions, for example. However, there are definitely schools that are more, that might have like other mission and values that supersede research. And if the depth and the breadth of those experiences are powerful enough, it could help you. Research definitely enhances or could open doors in terms of the schools that you could apply to. But I would definitely recommend you talk to your pre-health advisor about that more specifically. Do schools send out secondaries all around the same time or over the course of the summer? I don't know how it would be possible to finish everything by mid-July. It depends on the school. Some of them you're going to get a lot at once, to be honest. That's why it's a very busy time of year. And that's why we recommend really crafting a strategic school list, and again, not applying to so many schools that it becomes impossible to submit in a timely manner. But so yes, you'll get them around some different times, but for the vast majority, you get them around the same time.
That would also depend on when you submit your application as well, because if only the first batch of completed applications is sent June 30th. If you submit later, you could be getting secondaries later in the summer.
Good point, Emily. Thank you. Some schools ask about employment during the year other than winter and summer breaks. Does co-op count? What I usually tell people is anything and everything that you've done since undergrad goes in the application, whether it's work experience outside of your university, even if you're a Starbucks barista, that can go in your application. Schools are interested in seeing how your time is being delegated amongst all of your responsibilities. So co-op, of course, goes into your application. Even if it's something you continued after co-op ended, like in your per diem, yes, absolutely goes in your application. Does BU and Northeastern have combined workshops for medical school? No, we do not. We did have a school visit from BU, but that's really the only relationship we would have with any medical school visits. We can wait a few moments to see if there's any other questions in the chat. I think for now we can probably end the recording, but I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes to answer any other questions.